The dust swirled like judgment itself around that auction block in Redemption Creek, 1887, where a deaf-mute girl named Clara Rose stood chained like cattle until war-scarred rancher Ethan Hale saw the unbroken fire in her eyes and spent his last $50 to buy her freedom. Not knowing this single act would ignite a battle between superstition and salvation that would transform them both forever. Stay with me until the very end of this incredible journey and drop a comment letting me know what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel across the world. The sun beat down mercilessly on Redemption Creek's dusty Main Street, casting long shadows that seemed to crawl across the weathered wooden planks like dark omens. It was the kind of heat that made sensible folks seek shade, but today was auction day and the whole town had turned out despite the sweltering temperature. The air hung thick with the smell of horse sweat, tobacco juice, and something else. Something that made Ethan Hale's stomach turn as he approached the makeshift platform that had been erected in the town square. Ethan had come to buy a horse. His mare had thrown a shoe and gone lame 3 days prior, leaving him stranded at his ranch 5 miles outside of town. At 32, he'd seen enough of the world too much, perhaps during his years fighting in the war between the states. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jawline served as a permanent reminder of Antietam, where he'd lost his faith in both God and humanity. These days he preferred the company of livestock to people. Animals didn't lie, didn't betray, and didn't send young men to die for causes they barely understood. But as he pushed through the crowd gathered around the auction block, his weathered hands still bearing the calluses of both war and ranch work, Ethan realized this wasn't a livestock auction at all. "What am I bid for this fine specimen?" hollered Jebediah Carson, the town's self-appointed auctioneer, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd like a rusty blade. "She's young, healthy, and strong as an ox, perfect for heavy work or other purposes." Ethan's blood ran cold as his eyes found the platform. There, standing in the center of the wooden stage, was a young woman. She couldn't have been more than 19, with auburn hair that caught the sunlight despite being matted with dust and neglect. Her dress, if the tattered brown fabric could still be called that, hung in shreds around her thin frame. Rope bound her wrists behind her back, and her feet were bare and bleeding from what looked like a long, hard journey. But it was her eyes that stopped Ethan dead in his tracks. Green as spring grass and blazing with a defiance that no amount of abuse had been able to extinguish, they swept over the crowd with a mixture of contempt and unbroken spirit. When her gaze met his for just a moment, Ethan felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced since before the war. Something that might have been called hope if he'd been a man given to such foolish notions. $5, called out a voice from the crowd. Ethan turned to see Bartholomew Jenkins, the town drunk, waving a grimy hand in the air. "I'll give you $5 for her." The crowd erupted in laughter. "Jenkins, you ain't got 5 cents to your name, let alone $5, someone shouted. $10, came another voice. This one belonging to Marcus Webb, who owned the general store and had a reputation for working his hired help until they dropped. She looked sturdy enough. Ethan felt his jaw clench. He'd seen plenty of horrors during the war, but somehow this felt worse. At least soldiers chose their fate, even if they didn't always understand the consequences. This girl, for she was little more than that, had no choice at all. "Do I hear 15 to—" Carson continued, his beady eyes gleaming with greed. "Come now, gentlemen, look at those childbearing hips. She'd make fine breeding stock for the right man." That's when Ethan noticed something that made his stomach lurch. The girl wasn't responding to the auctioneer's words. Her eyes tracked the movement of the crowd, but when Carson spoke directly to her, even shouted at her, she showed no reaction whatsoever. "She's deaf as a post," Carson announced, apparently noticing Ethan's observation. "Mute too, from what I can tell. Can't speak a lick, but that might be a blessing depending on what you have in mind." More laughter rippled through the crowd. "Where did she come from?" Ethan found himself asking, his voice carrying further than he'd intended. Carson squinted down at him from the platform. Found her wandering the desert 3 days ago, half dead from thirst. No identification, no family to speak of. Sheriff figured the best thing was to auction her off to someone who could put her to good use. Can't have vagrants cluttering up our fine town. Ethan's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Sheriff Morrison was nowhere to be seen, of course. The coward probably couldn't stomach watching his handiwork firsthand. $15, Webb called out again. And that's my final offer. Do I hear 20? Carson scanned the crowd hopefully. In the brief silence that followed, Ethan caught sight of movement from the platform. The girl had shifted slightly, turning her head toward a small group of children who had gathered near the front of the crowd. One of them, a little boy no more than 6 or 7, was tugging frantically on his mother's skirt and pointing at the girl. The woman Ethan recognized her as Martha Edison, the preacher's widow, yanked the child back harshly. "Don't point at her, Timothy," Martha hissed, her voice carrying across the square. "That creature is cursed by the devil himself. Look at those eyes green as sin. No decent Christian woman has eyes like that." The girl's gaze found the little boy, and something extraordinary happened. Despite her bound hands and desperate situation, she smiled. It wasn't a bitter or broken smile, but something genuine and warm, as if she were trying to comfort the child rather than seeking comfort for herself. She nodded at him gently and even began to hum a soft melodic sound that somehow carried over the noise of the crowd. The boy stopped tugging on his mother's dress and stared transfixed. Other children began to gather, drawn by the strange, beautiful sound. But their parents quickly pulled them away, muttering about witchcraft and devil's music. $20. The voice cut through the murmur like a whip crack. It took Ethan a moment to realize it was his own voice. The crowd turned to stare at him, and Carson's eyes lit up with greedy excitement. $20 from the gentleman in the back. Do I hear 25? Ethan barely heard him. He was watching the girl who had stopped humming and was now looking directly at him. There was something in her expression, surprise perhaps, but also a flicker of what might have been gratitude. Or maybe it was just his imagination. "Who is that man?" he heard someone whisper. "Ain't seen him in town for months." "That's Ethan Hale," came the reply. "Lives out at the old Brennan place. Keeps to himself mostly. Some say he ain't been right in the head since the war." Webb raised his hand. 25. 30, Ethan called out without hesitation, taking a step forward through the crowd. Now people were really staring. $30 was more money than most folks in Redemption Creek saw in 3 months. Ethan could feel the weight of their gazes, could hear the whispered speculation about his motives and his sanity. He ignored them all, keeping his eyes fixed on the girl. She was studying him now with obvious curiosity, her head tilted slightly to one side. When she caught him looking, she didn't look away as most people would. Instead, she seemed to be trying to read something in his face, to understand what had prompted this stranger to bid on her freedom. 35, Webb countered, his face flushed with anger and determination. 40, Ethan responded immediately. The crowd had fallen silent, now sensing that this had become more than just an auction. It had become a contest of wills, and everyone wanted to see how it would play out. Webb hesitated, clearly calculating whether his pride was worth more than the money. $40 was serious money enough to buy a good horse or a month's worth of supplies. Finally, he shook his head and stepped back into the crowd. $40, Carson announced triumphantly. Do I hear 45 going once, going twice? 50, Ethan said quietly, but his voice carried clearly in the sudden hush. Carson's eyes went wide. Even he seemed stunned by the amount. $50. Did I hear correctly? $50. Ethan nodded. Reaching into his jacket pocket for his leather pouch, he felt the weight of his remaining coins, exactly $50.37. Everything he had left in the world after buying supplies for the winter. Going once? Going twice? Sold to the gentleman for $50. The crowd erupted in chatter as Ethan made his way toward the platform. He could hear fragments of conversation following him. $50 for a deaf mute. He's lost his mind. What's he planning to do with her? Mark my words, no good will come of this. But Ethan paid them no attention. He climbed the steps to the platform where Carson was already untying the ropes from the girl's wrists. Up close, Ethan could see the full extent of her ordeal. Her arms were marked with rope burns and what looked like older scars. Her face, though beautiful beneath the dirt and exhaustion, bore the gaunt look of someone who hadn't eaten a proper meal in weeks. There you go, mister, Carson said, pocketing the coins Ethan handed him. She's all yours. Can't promise she'll be much use to you being afflicted as she is, but that's your concern now. The girl rubbed her wrists where the ropes had been looking up at Ethan with those remarkable green eyes. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, she made a series of quick hand gestures that Ethan didn't understand. "Don't waste your time trying to talk to her," Carson advised with a laugh. "She's simple as well as deaf. Probably doesn't understand a word you're saying." But Ethan wasn't so sure. There was an intelligence in the girl's eyes that belied Carson's crude assessment. She was watching his face intently, and when he extended his hand to help her down from the platform, she studied it for a long moment before placing her own small, calloused hand in his. Her touch was warm, despite everything she'd been through, and Ethan felt that strange stirring in his chest again. As she stepped down beside him, he realized she was taller than she'd appeared on the platform, probably 5.5 feet, with a grace of movement that suggested she was stronger than her slight build indicated. "What's her name?" Ethan asked Carson. The auctioneer shrugged. "Sheriff just called her the girl." "Could be anything, I suppose. You can name her whatever you like, now she's your property." Property. The word hit Ethan like a physical blow. He looked down at the young woman beside him, who was watching the exchange with obvious confusion. Whatever else she might be, she was no one's property. "Come on," he said gently, not sure if she could understand him, but hoping his tone would convey his intentions. "Let's get you out of here." As they made their way through the crowd toward where Ethan had left his borrowed horse and wagon, he could feel eyes boring into his back and hear the whispered comments that followed in their wake. Some people seemed merely curious about his motives, but others were clearly disapproving. "Ethan Hale." The voice belonged to Martha Edison, who had pushed through the crowd to intercept them. "I hope you know what you're doing bringing that creature into our community." Ethan stopped and turned to face the preacher's widow. Martha was a thin, severe woman in her 40s, dressed entirely in black despite the heat. Her dark hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin around her eyes, and those eyes held a fanatical gleam that made Ethan uncomfortable. "I'm taking her to my ranch, Mrs. Edison," he replied evenly. "I don't see how that concerns anyone in town." "It concerns all of us when you bring evil into our midst," Martha shot back. "Look at her, those unnatural eyes, that devil's music she was making. Mark my words, no good will come of this. She's cursed, I tell you. Cursed." The girl had moved slightly behind Ethan during this exchange, but she was still watching Martha's face with that same intense concentration. When Martha pointed an accusing finger at her, the girl's expression didn't change, but Ethan felt her tense beside him. "The only curse I see here is ignorance." Ethan set his voice hard with controlled anger. "Now, if you'll excuse us." He placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder, guiding her toward his wagon. She came willingly, but he could sense her unease at the hostile atmosphere surrounding them. The wagon was an old buckboard that had seen better days, pulled by a brown gelding named Rusty that Ethan had borrowed from his neighbor Jim Patterson. As they approached, the girl suddenly stopped and made those quick hand gestures again, this time pointing toward the horse. Ethan watched in amazement as she approached Rusty slowly, her hands extended. The horse, which was normally skittish around strangers, stood perfectly still as she ran her hands along his neck and down his legs. She seemed to be examining him, checking for something. "What are you doing?" Ethan asked, though he didn't expect an answer. The girl looked up at him and pointed to the horse's right front hoof, then made a gesture that looked like she was picking something up and throwing it away. When Ethan knelt to examine the hoof, he found a sharp stone wedged between the shoe and the frog, something that would have caused the horse considerable pain if left untreated. "How did you—" Ethan began, but the girl was already moving to check the harness. She adjusted several straps that Ethan hadn't even noticed were sitting wrong, her movements quick and confident. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered under his breath. Whatever else this girl might be, she clearly knew her way around horses. The ride back to the ranch was conducted mostly in silence. The girl Ethan found himself thinking of her as Clara Rose, the name Carson had mentioned, sat beside him on the wagon seat, her eyes constantly moving as she took in her surroundings. Occasionally she would point to something, a hawk circling overhead, a jackrabbit darting across the road, a patch of wildflowers growing beside a creek, and look at him as if asking for its name. Hawk, Ethan would say, or rabbit, or Indian paintbrush. She would nod and mouth the word silently, as if storing it away for future reference. It was during one of these exchanges that Ethan realized something important: she could read lips, at least to some extent. When he spoke directly to her and kept his words simple, she seemed to understand. This changed everything. She wasn't simple or stupid, as Carson had suggested. She was just trapped in a world of silence, trying to navigate by whatever clues she could gather. The sun was beginning to sink toward the western horizon when they finally reached the Double H Ranch. It wasn't much to look at: a small log cabin, a barn that needed repair, and a handful of outbuildings scattered across a valley floor that was more dust than grass after the long summer drought. But it was home, and after years of wandering after the war, that meant something to Ethan. Clara Rose sat up straighter as they approached the house, her eyes taking in every detail. When they passed the corral where Ethan's remaining horses were gathered, she made an excited sound, the first vocal noise he'd heard from her since her humming at the auction. "You like horses?" Ethan observed as he helped her down from the wagon. She nodded enthusiastically, then pointed to herself and made a series of gestures that he was beginning to recognize as her way of trying to communicate complex ideas. "You've worked with horses before," he said, more as a statement than a question. Another nod, this one accompanied by what might have been relief that he was beginning to understand her. As they walked toward the house, Ethan found himself wondering about her story. Where had she come from? How had she ended up wandering the desert alone? Did she have family somewhere, people who were looking for her? The questions multiplied in his mind, but he knew they would have to wait. Right now she needed food, rest, and safety. The cabin was sparse but clean, a main room that served as both kitchen and living area, a small bedroom, and a loft that Ethan had been using for storage. It wasn't much, but it was better than being sold like livestock in the town square. Clara Rose stood in the doorway looking around with those bright green eyes. She seemed to be cataloging everything from the stone fireplace to the simple wooden table where Ethan took his meals. When her gaze fell on the tin of coffee sitting on the counter, she made a questioning gesture. "Coffee," Ethan said. "Would you like some?" She nodded eagerly, and Ethan realized she was probably as tired as she was hungry. He set about building up the fire and putting water on to boil, acutely aware of her watching his every movement. It occurred to him that she was probably trying to learn the layout of her new environment, figuring out how things worked in this strange place she'd found herself. While the water heated, Ethan rummaged through his limited food supplies. He'd been planning to go to town for provisions when his horse went lame, so pickings were slim. But he managed to find some jerky hardtack and a can of peaches that had been saving for a special occasion. If rescuing a girl from slavery didn't qualify as special, he didn't know what would. Clara Rose accepted the food, gratefully eating with the careful restraint of someone who had known real hunger. She made the jerky, last chewing each piece thoroughly, and savored the peaches as if they were the finest delicacy. Watching her eat, Ethan felt a surge of anger at whoever had allowed her to reach such a state. As they shared their simple meal, Ethan found himself studying her more closely. Beneath the dirt and exhaustion, she was genuinely beautiful, with high cheekbones, a straight nose, and skin that would probably be creamy white once she'd had a chance to wash. Her hair, which had looked brown in the harsh sunlight of the auction, proved to be a rich auburn with golden highlights. But it was her eyes that continued to fascinate him. Not just their unusual color, but the intelligence and spirit that shone in them, despite everything she'd endured. After supper, Ethan showed her to the bedroom. "You can sleep here," he said, pointing to the bed and then to her. "I'll take the loft." She looked confused, making gestures that seemed to indicate she didn't understand why he was giving up his bed for her. "You're not my property," Ethan said carefully, making sure she could see his lips. "You're a guest. A friend, maybe. Friends help each other." Something in her expression shifted at his words. For just a moment, her carefully maintained composure cracked, and he saw a flash of raw emotion, gratitude, relief, and something that might have been hope. She pressed her hands to her chest and then extended them toward him in what was clearly a gesture of thanks. "You're welcome," Ethan replied softly. She started to turn toward the bedroom, then stopped and looked back at him. Opening her mouth, she made a sound, not quite a word, but something deliberate and meaningful. It took Ethan a moment to realize what she was trying to say. "Clara," he said. "Your name is Clara Rose." She nodded, then pointed to him with a questioning look. "Ethan," he said. Ethan Hale. She mouthed his name silently, her lips forming the syllables with careful precision. Then she smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her since the moment with the little boy at the auction. It transformed her entire face, making her look younger and somehow lighting up the dim cabin. That night, as Ethan lay in the loft listening to the desert wind whistle around the eaves, he found himself thinking about the day's events. What had he done? He'd spent his last $50 on a woman he didn't know, a woman who couldn't hear or speak, a woman who was probably carrying enough trauma to sink a battleship. By any reasonable measure, it was the act of a madman. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw those green eyes blazing with unbroken spirit on the auction platform. He saw her gentle smile for the frightened child. He saw the way she'd handled Rusty with a skill and intuition that spoke of years of experience. And he remembered the gratitude in her face when he told her she wasn't his property. Maybe he was crazy. Maybe Martha Edison was right, and he'd brought some kind of curse down on himself. But as he finally drifted off to sleep, Ethan found he didn't much care. For the first time since the war, he'd done something that felt genuinely right. Whatever came next, he could live with the consequences of that. In the room below, Clara Rose lay awake on the soft mattress, the first real bed she'd slept in for longer than she could remember. She stared up at the rough wooden ceiling, trying to process everything that had happened. This morning, she'd been a piece of property waiting to be sold to the highest bidder. Tonight, she was what free safe? She wasn't sure those concepts even had meaning in her world anymore. But the man Ethan had called her a friend, a guest. He'd given her his bed and asked for nothing in return. He'd looked at her and seen something other than damaged goods or a curiosity to be gawked at. When was the last time anyone had treated her with such simple human kindness? Clara Rose closed her eyes and let herself imagine just for a moment what it might be like to stay here. To wake up each morning without fear to work with the horses, she could sense grazing in the corral outside, to maybe even find a way to truly communicate with someone who seemed willing to listen. It was a dangerous dream, she knew. In her experience, kindness always came with a price, and sanctuary was usually temporary. But as exhaustion finally claimed her, Clara Rose allowed herself to hold on to that dangerous dream just a little while longer. Outside, the desert night settled over the Double H Ranch, bringing with it the promise of new challenges and unexpected possibilities. Neither Ethan nor Clara Rose could have imagined the trials that lay ahead, the suspicion and fear of the townspeople, the dangers that would test their growing bond, and the extraordinary gifts that would soon be revealed. But for now, for this one night, they were simply two wounded souls who had found an unexpected refuge in each other's company. The auction in Redemption Creek had ended, but their real story was just beginning. Dawn broke over the Double H Ranch with the kind of golden light that made even the harshest desert landscape look beautiful for a few precious moments. Ethan had been awake since before sunrise, a habit ingrained by years of military service and ranch life. He dressed quietly and made his way down from the loft, careful not to wake Clara Rose, who was still sleeping peacefully in the bedroom. As he stepped outside to check on the horses, he was surprised to find the cabin door already open and Clara Rose nowhere to be seen. His heart lurched with sudden panic. Had she run away during the night? Had someone come for her while he slept? But then he heard it, that same melodic humming he'd witnessed at the auction, drifting from the direction of the corral. He found her standing among his horses, her auburn hair catching the morning light as she moved from animal to animal with an easy confidence that took his breath away. She was still wearing the tattered dress from yesterday, but somehow she looked different, more alive, more herself. Rusty the borrowed gelding was nuzzling her shoulder while she examined the other horses with gentle, knowing hands. "Morning," Ethan called softly, making sure she could see him before he approached. Clara Rose turned toward him with that transformative smile, pointing excitedly at a bay mare named Duchess, who was normally skittish around strangers. The horse was standing perfectly still while Clara Rose ran her hands along her legs, her face creased with concentration. "She's favoring her left rear hoof," Ethan observed, walking closer. Clara Rose nodded and made a series of quick gestures, then knelt beside Duchess's hoof. She worked with practiced efficiency, her fingers finding and removing a small piece of embedded gravel that Ethan hadn't even noticed was there. Duchess whickered softly and nudged Clara Rose's shoulder. and what was clearly gratitude. "How did you know?" Ethan asked, genuinely amazed. Clara Rose tapped her chest, then placed both hands flat against Duchess's side. She closed her eyes for a moment as if listening to something only she could hear. When she opened them again, she pointed to herself and then to all the horses, making a gesture that seemed to encompass some kind of connection between them. "You can feel what they feel," Ethan said slowly, trying to understand. Her face lit up with excitement at his comprehension. She nodded vigorously, then moved to his stallion. Thunder, a black quarter horse with a reputation for being difficult. Thunder had been nervous around strangers ever since a lightning strike had spooked him badly the previous spring. But as Clara Rose approached, the horse grew calm, lowering his great head so she could stroke his neck. She placed her hands on Thunder's forehead and closed her eyes again. After a moment, she opened them and looked at Ethan with an expression of deep sadness. She pointed to the sky, then made a zigzag motion with her finger lightning. Then she touched her own chest and shook her head as if saying the fear was still there, still hurting. "You can sense his memories," Ethan breathed. "The storm that scared him." Clara Rose nodded, then did something extraordinary. She began to hum again, but this time it was different, a soothing, rhythmic melody that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of a heartbeat. Thunder's ears pricked forward, and gradually his muscles relaxed, the wild look that had haunted his eyes since the lightning strike began to fade. "I'll be damned," Ethan murmured. "You're healing him." The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted the moment. Ethan turned to see his neighbor, Jim Patterson, riding up the dusty trail that led to the ranch. Behind him rode Sheriff Morrison and two other men Ethan didn't recognize immediately. His stomach clenched with foreboding. "Clara," he said quietly, not wanting to alarm her but needing her attention. "Go to the house. Now." She must have read the tension in his voice and posture because she immediately stepped away from Thunder and began walking toward the cabin. But Ethan could see her glancing back, clearly worried about what was happening. "Morning, Ethan," Jim called out as the four men dismounted near the corral. Patterson was a decent man in his 50s with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life working outdoors, but today he looked uncomfortable, avoiding Ethan's eyes. "Jim," Ethan replied carefully. "Sheriff, what brings you all the way out here so early?" Sheriff Morrison was a portly man with a badge that seemed too small for his expansive gut. He'd been elected more for his willingness to look the other way when important people bent the rules than for any particular law enforcement skills. The other two men were strangers, well-dressed city types who looked distinctly out of place on a dusty ranch. "We heard about your purchase yesterday," Morrison said, mopping sweat from his forehead with a stained handkerchief. "These gentlemen have some questions about the girl." One of the strangers stepped forward. He was tall and lean with sharp features and cold gray eyes that reminded Ethan unpleasantly of a hawk studying its prey. "Mr. Hale, I'm Thomas Roosevelt representing certain business interests in the territory. This is my associate, Dr. Samuel Crane." The second man was shorter and rounder with wire-rimmed spectacles and the soft hands of someone who'd never done manual labor. He carried a black leather bag that marked him as some kind of medical professional. "What kind of business interests?" Ethan asked, not offering to shake hands. "The kind that are concerned when unusual individuals surface in our communities," Roosevelt replied smoothly. "We've heard reports about your acquisition yesterday, a deaf-mute girl with certain unusual characteristics." "She's not unusual," Ethan said flatly. "She's just deaf." Dr. Crane cleared his throat. "Mr. Hale, we've received reports that this individual may possess certain abnormal capabilities. We'd like to examine her for the good of science and the safety of the community." "Examine her," Ethan's voice took on a dangerous edge. "She's not a specimen, doctor. She's a human being." Of course," Roosevelt interjected quickly. "But surely you understand our concern. Reports of supernatural abilities can cause panic among the simple folk. We merely want to verify that there's nothing to worry about." "What reports?" Ethan demanded, though he suspected he already knew. Sheriff Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "Well, there's been talk in town since yesterday. Martha Edison's been telling folks that the girl made devil's music, and some of the children said she was casting spells on them. She hummed a lullaby to comfort a scared child." Ethan said, his patience wearing thin. If that's witchcraft, then every mother in the territory is a sorceress. Nevertheless, Roosevelt continued, we'd appreciate the opportunity to speak with her. Surely you have nothing to hide. It was a trap, and Ethan knew it. Refuse, and they'd claim he was protecting something dangerous. Agree, and they'd subject Clara Rose to God knew what kind of examination or interrogation. He was still weighing his options when the decision was taken out of his hands. Ethan, Clara Rose's voice was soft and uncertain, but it carried clearly across the yard. She was standing in the doorway of the cabin, her hands clasped in front of her like a shield. The four visitors turned to stare at her, and Ethan saw Roosevelt's eyes narrow with interest. Doctor. Crane actually pulled out a small notebook and began scribbling observations. Miss Shesk, Roosevelt called out, his tone falsely friendly. Could you join us, please? We'd like to have a word with you. Clara Rose looked at Ethan questioningly, clearly not understanding what Roosevelt had said, but sensing the tension in the air. Ethan wanted to tell her to go back inside to hide until these men left, but he knew that would only make things worse. It's all right, he said gently, walking toward her. These men want to talk to you. I'll be right here. She nodded and walked with him toward the group, but Ethan could feel her nervousness in the way she stayed close to his side. When they reached the others, Roosevelt stepped forward with what he probably thought was a reassuring smile. Good morning, my dear, he said, speaking slowly and loudly, as if volume could overcome deafness. I'm Thomas Roosevelt. Can you understand me? Clara Rose looked from Roosevelt to Ethan, her expression puzzled. She made a few hand gestures trying to communicate that she couldn't hear what was being said. She reads lips, Ethan explained, but only if you speak directly to her and keep your words simple. Dr. Crane looked up from his notebook with obvious excitement. Fascinating, and the reports of her unusual abilities with animals. She's good with horses, Ethan said defensively. Lots of people are. We heard she can sense their thoughts, Sheriff Morrison added unhelpfully, maybe even control them with her mind. Clara Rose must have caught enough of the conversation to understand what they were discussing because her face went pale. She stepped behind Ethan, using his body as a shield between herself and the visitors. She's afraid, Ethan said, his protective instincts flaring. You're scaring her. We don't mean any harm, Roosevelt assured him. We simply want to understand what we're dealing with. Perhaps she could demonstrate her talents with the horses. No, Ethan said flatly. She's not a circus act. But Clara Rose surprised him by tugging on his sleeve. When he looked down at her, she pointed to herself and then to the horses, making gestures that seemed to indicate she was willing to show them what she could do. You don't have to prove anything to them, Ethan said softly. She smiled at him with a courage that made his chest tighten, then walked toward the corral where Thunder was still standing. The big stallion raised his head as she approached, nickering softly in greeting. The watching men fell silent as Clara Rose placed her hands on Thunder's neck and closed her eyes. After a moment, she began that soft humming again, not the lullaby from yesterday, but something deeper and more complex. The melody seemed to wrap around them all, creating an almost hypnotic atmosphere. Thunder responded immediately, his ears pricking forward and his entire posture relaxing. But it was more than just calming. There was something almost otherworldly about the connection between the girl and the horse. They seemed to be communicating on a level that transcended normal understanding. Then something happened that made even Ethan's breath catch in his throat. Thunder began to move not in response to any visible command, but as if Clara Rose was guiding him through pure thought. The stallion walked in a perfect circle around the corral, then broke into a smooth trot, his movements flowing like water. Remarkable, Dr. Crane whispered, scribbling furiously in his notebook. The level of control is unprecedented. But Roosevelt's reaction was quite different. His face had gone hard with calculation and what might have been greed. Very interesting indeed, he murmured. Very interesting. Clara Rose opened her eyes and stepped back from Thunder, who immediately returned to his normal behavior. She looked at the assembled men with a mixture of pride and apprehension, clearly hoping she'd somehow satisfied their curiosity. Wonderful demonstration, my dear, Roosevelt said, his smile not reaching his eyes. Truly remarkable. Tell me, have you always had this gift? Clara Rose looked to Ethan for translation. When he repeated the question more simply, she nodded and pointed to herself as a child, then made gestures indicating she'd been working with animals for many years. And your family, Roosevelt continued, did they share your abilities? At this question, Clara Rose's face crumpled with grief. She shook her head violently and made gestures that clearly indicated loss and death. Tears began to flow down her cheeks as she tried to communicate something urgent and painful. That's enough, Ethan said firmly, moving to put his arm around Clara Rose's shoulders. Can't you see you're upsetting her? Of course, Roosevelt replied, though his eyes remained fixed on Clara Rose with unsettling intensity. We wouldn't want to cause distress. But surely you understand, Mr. Hale, that abilities like this raise certain questions about public safety. Public safety, Ethan's voice was dangerously quiet. She calmed a frightened horse. How exactly does that threaten public safety? Dr. Crane cleared his throat again. Mr. Hale, in my professional opinion, individuals with such unusual neurological presentations often exhibit unpredictable behaviors. It might be best if the young lady could be placed somewhere where she could receive proper care and observation. You mean locked up? Ethan said bluntly. Now, Roosevelt interjected. No one said anything about locking anyone up. We're simply suggesting that she might benefit from proper medical attention and study. For her own good, of course. Clara Rose had been following the conversation as best she could, and something in Roosevelt's tone must have alarmed her because she suddenly gripped Ethan's arm tightly. She looked up at him with frightened eyes and shook her head frantically. She doesn't want to go with you, Ethan said. And she doesn't have to. Last I checked, this was still a free country. Sheriff Morrison shifted uncomfortably. Well now, Ethan, that might depend on whether she's considered competent to make her own decisions, being deaf and mute and all. She's deaf, not stupid, Ethan snapped. And she's not mute either, she just can't speak normally. But she understands plenty. Nevertheless, Roosevelt said smoothly, the law regarding individuals with mental deficiencies is quite clear. If she's deemed unable to care for herself... She's been caring for herself just fine, Ethan interrupted. Better than fine, she's got more horse sense than most people I know. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but it was interrupted by the sound of more approaching riders. This time, it was a larger group, at least 6 men on horseback, led by someone Ethan recognized with a sinking heart. Marcus Webb, the store owner who'd been bidding against him at the auction, rode at the head of the group. Behind him were several other townspeople, including Martha Edison's son, Jonathan, a hot-headed young man who'd appointed himself as the unofficial enforcer of his mother's religious views. Well, Webb called out as the group rode into the yard. Looks like we're not the only ones concerned about this situation. Roosevelt turned to greet the newcomers with obvious satisfaction. Mr. Webb, I presume we've been having a most enlightening conversation with Mr. Hale about his acquisition. Acquisition! Webb's face flushed with anger. That girl should have been mine. I had every right to bid higher, but he cheated somehow. Nobody spends $50 on a broken-down deaf mute unless they know something the rest of us don't. Mr. Webb raises an interesting point, Roosevelt mused. Perhaps you could enlighten us, Mr. Hale, about why you felt compelled to pay such an extraordinary sum. Ethan felt Clara Rose press closer to his side, her fear palpable. The situation was spiraling out of control, and he knew that anything he said would only make things worse. But he had to try. I paid what I thought she was worth, he said simply. As a human being. Jonathan Edison laughed harshly. Human being. Did you see what she just did with that horse? That's not natural Hale. That's witchcraft, pure and simple. My mother's been praying for guidance all night, another voice added. It was Timothy Martha Edison's youngest son, barely 18 and full of his family's righteous fury. The Lord revealed to her in a vision that this creature is an instrument of Satan sent to corrupt our community. Dr. Crane looked up from his notebook with academic interest. Fascinating. Religious hysteria often accompanies encounters with unexplained phenomena. It's quite predictable, really. His dismissive tone only inflamed the townspeople further. Hysteria. Jonathan Edison's hand moved to the gun at his hip. Are you calling my mother a liar, city man? Gentlemen, please, Roosevelt interjected smoothly. Let's not allow emotions to cloud our judgment. The facts are clear. We have an individual with unusual abilities living in our community without proper supervision or study. Surely we can all agree that this situation requires careful handling. Ethan realized with growing alarm that Roosevelt was deliberately inflaming both sides of the conflict, playing the townspeople's fears against the visitor's supposed scientific interest. But to what end? His question was answered when Sheriff Morrison cleared his throat nervously. Mr. Roosevelt here has made the county an offer, he announced. He's willing to take the girl off our hands and transport her to a proper facility where she can be studied and cared for, all legal and proper-like. Studied? Ethan's blood ran cold. What kind of facility? A private research institution, Roosevelt explained. We specialize in individuals with unique neurological presentations. She would be very well cared for, I assure you. Clara Rose might not have understood every word, but she clearly grasped the intent. She began shaking her head frantically, making desperate gestures to Ethan. Her humming took on a frantic, discordant quality that made all the horses in the corral begin moving restlessly. Look at that, Webb shouted, pointing at the agitated animals. She's casting a spell right in front of us. She's frightened, Ethan said loudly, trying to be heard over the growing commotion. You're all scaring her, and the horses are picking up on her fear. But his explanation was lost in the rising tide of hysteria. The horses were indeed becoming more agitated, feeding off Clara Rose's terror in a feedback loop that threatened to spiral completely out of control. Thunder reared up on his hind legs, whinnying in distress, while the other animals milled about in confusion. Do something, Timothy Edison yelled. Stop her before she kills us all. Dr. Crane pulled a small vial from his medical bag. I have a sedative that should calm her, he announced, moving toward Clara Rose with obvious intent. That's when Ethan lost his temper completely. He stepped in front of Clara Rose, his hand moving to the Colt .45 he wore at his hip. Nobody touches her. He said, his voice carrying the deadly calm of a man who'd killed before and wouldn't hesitate to do so again. The yard fell silent except for the restless movements of the horses and Clara Rose's increasingly frantic humming. Every man present suddenly remembered that Ethan Hale was a war veteran who'd survived some of the bloodiest battles of the conflict. The scar on his face seemed to stand out more prominently in the tense atmosphere. Now, Ethan, Sheriff Morrison said carefully, there's no need for violence. We're all reasonable men here. Are we? Ethan asked, his eyes never leaving Roosevelt's face. Because it seems to me like you're all planning to kidnap a young woman against her will. Roosevelt's mask of civility finally slipped, revealing the calculating predator beneath. Mr. Hale, you're hardly in a position to dictate terms. You're outnumbered 10-1 and harboring an individual who may pose a threat to public safety. I suggest you step aside and let us handle this situation properly. The only threat I see here is you, Ethan replied. Clara stays with me. Clara. Roosevelt's eyebrows rose. So you've named your pet. The casual cruelty of the comment hit Ethan like a physical blow. But it was Clara Rose's reaction that truly broke his heart. She understood enough to know she was being discussed like an animal, and the humiliation and pain in her face was almost unbearable to witness. But then something changed in her expression. The fear and hurt were replaced by a growing anger that seemed to transform her from victim to something far more formidable. Her humming stopped abruptly, and in the sudden silence, every horse in the corral turned to look at her with what could only be described as attention. "A boss," one of Webb's men said nervously. "Maybe we should—" He never finished the sentence. Clara Rose raised her hand, and Thunder launched himself over the corral fence in a magnificent leap that carried him directly toward the group of mounted men. He wasn't attacking. His intent seemed to be to position himself between Clara Rose and anyone who might threaten her, but the effect was electric. The visiting horses reared and plunged their riders, fighting to maintain control. Webb's mount actually threw him, sending the store owner sprawling in the dust. Within seconds, the organized confrontation had devolved into chaos as men scrambled to avoid being trampled by their own animals. Only Jim Patterson managed to maintain control of his horse, and Ethan noticed that the older man was actually grinning as he watched the city folks struggle with their mounts. "Enough!" Roosevelt shouted, drawing a small pistol from his coat. "Stop this now or I'll put a bullet in her." The threat had an immediate effect. Clara Rose's concentration broke, and the horses suddenly returned to normal behavior, leaving their riders to sort themselves out as best they could. But the damage was done. Any pretense of civilized negotiation had been abandoned. Ethan's Colt was in his hand before Roosevelt's gun was fully clear of his coat. "I wouldn't," he said quietly. For a moment, the two men faced each other across the dusty yard, weapons drawn and fingers on triggers. The tension was so thick it seemed to have physical weight pressing down on everyone present. It was Sheriff Morrison who broke the stalemate. "Put the guns away, both of you," he said with more authority than Ethan had ever heard from him. "This has gone far enough." Slowly, reluctantly, both men lowered their weapons, but the hostility between them remained palpable. "This isn't over, Hale," Roosevelt said as he holstered his pistol. "One way or another, that girl will come with us. If not today, then soon." "We'll see about that," Ethan replied. Roosevelt remounted his horse with as much dignity as he could muster. "Come, Doctor. We have other matters to attend to." As the two strangers rode away, followed by the still grumbling townspeople, Jim Patterson lingered behind. When the others were out of earshot, he rode closer to where Ethan and Clara Rose were standing. "That was quite a show, he said admiringly. "Haven't seen anything like it since my grandfather told stories about the old Apache horse whisperers." "Jim?" Ethan began, but the older man held up a hand. "I don't need explanations, son. What I saw was a frightened girl protecting herself the only way she knew how. And what I heard was a bunch of men planning to do something that ain't right no matter how they dress it up in fancy words." He looked directly at Clara Rose, who was watching him with wary attention. "Miss," he said slowly and clearly, "if these folks give you any more trouble, you send word to Jim Patterson. I may be getting old, but I can still shoot straight when I need to." Clara Rose's face brightened with gratitude, and she pressed her hands to her heart in a gesture of thanks. "You'd better watch yourself, Jim," Sheriff Morrison warned as he prepared to leave. "Harboring fugitives is a serious crime." "Fugitive?" Patterson laughed. "Morrison, that girl hasn't committed any crime except being different. Last I checked, that wasn't illegal in this country." After the sheriff departed, shaking his head in disapproval, Jim turned back to Ethan. "You need supplies from town." "I was planning to go tomorrow," Ethan replied. "I'll handle it," Patterson said firmly. "Make me a list. It wouldn't be smart for you to show your face in Redemption Creek for a while. Feelings are running pretty high." As Patterson rode away, Ethan found himself alone with Clara Rose in the aftermath of the morning's confrontation. She was standing beside Thunder, who had returned to the corral and was nuzzling her shoulder protectively. Her face was pale but determined, and there was something new in her eyes, a recognition that her gift, whatever it was, made her both valuable and vulnerable in ways she was only beginning to understand. "I'm sorry," Ethan said softly. "I didn't know bringing you here would put you in danger." Clara Rose shook her head and made gestures that seemed to indicate it wasn't his fault. Then she pointed to herself, and to him, making a gesture that encompassed the ranch and seemed to ask if she could stay. "As long as you want," Ethan assured her. "This is your home now, if you'll have it." The smile that crossed her face was worth all the trouble that was surely coming their way. But as they walked back toward the house together, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Roosevelt's visit was just the beginning of their problems. Men like that didn't give up easily, especially when they sensed profit or power to be gained. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a darker thought was taking shape. If Clara Rose's abilities were real, and after what he'd witnessed, he couldn't doubt it, then she represented something far more significant than even he had realized. The question was whether they could protect her long enough for her to learn to protect herself. The storm clouds gathering on the horizon seemed to echo his concerns, promising that the trials ahead would test them both in ways they couldn't yet imagine. 3 weeks passed in deceptive peace after Roosevelt's visit, but Ethan could feel the tension building like pressure before a thunderstorm. Clara Rose had settled into ranch life with remarkable ease, her gift with animals proving invaluable as she helped nurse a sick colt back to health and gentled 2 wild Mustangs that had been giving Ethan trouble for months. She'd also begun communicating more effectively, developing a complex system of gestures and expressions that allowed them to have increasingly sophisticated conversations. It was during one of these quiet mornings, as Clara Rose worked with the Mustangs in the corral, that Ethan first noticed the dust cloud on the horizon. At first, he thought it might be Jim Patterson returning from another supply run to town, but as the cloud grew larger, he realized it was too big for one rider. His stomach clenched with familiar dread as he counted at least a dozen horses approaching at a steady pace. "Clara," he called, making sure she could see him. When she looked up from the Mustang she was gentling, he pointed toward the approaching riders and made a gesture they'd developed to mean danger. Her face went pale, but she didn't panic. Instead, she quickly led the Mustang back into the corral and latched the gate, her movements efficient and purposeful. In the weeks since Roosevelt's visit, they'd both known this moment would come. The only question was what form the next confrontation would take. As the riders drew closer, Ethan could make out familiar figures among them. Sheriff Morrison was there, looking more uncomfortable than ever. Thomas Roosevelt rode beside him, his face set in grim determination. But it was the third man who made Ethan's blood run cold. Judge Samuel Hartwell, the territorial magistrate, whose reputation for harsh justice was matched only by his willingness to bend the law for the right price. Behind them rode a collection of townspeople and strangers, some carrying rifles, and all wearing expressions that boded ill for anyone who got in their way. Ethan noticed Martha Edison among them, her face twisted with righteous fury, and her son Jonathan, whose hand rested conspicuously on his gun butt. "Ethan Hale!" Judge Hartwell's voice boomed across the yard as the group came to a halt near the house. "By order of the territorial court, you are commanded to surrender the individual known as Clara Rose for examination and potential commitment to a state institution." Ethan stepped out of the house, Clara Rose close behind him. She was trying to stay calm, but he could see the fear in her eyes and feel the tension radiating from her like heat from a forge. "On what grounds, Judge?" Ethan asked, his voice steady despite the anger building in his chest. Hartwell unfolded an official-looking document with theatrical flourish. "Petition for involuntary commitment of a mentally deficient individual deemed a danger to public safety. Signed by 12 prominent citizens of Redemption Creek and certified by Dr. Samuel Crane as medically necessary." "She's not mentally deficient," Ethan said flatly, "and she's not a danger to anyone." Roosevelt urged his horse forward, a satisfied smile playing around his lips. "Mr. Hale, we have numerous witness statements attesting to supernatural occurrences in connection with this individual. Horses moving without apparent command, animals becoming agitated in her presence, and reports of her attempting to bewitch local children with unholy music." "Those are lies, and you know it," Ethan shot back. "Are they—" Martha Edison's voice cut through the morning air like a rusty blade. "Tell me, Mr. Haley, can you deny that she made those horses obey her without any natural means of control? Can you deny that she's cast some kind of spell over you, making you spend your life savings on damaged goods?" Clara Rose had been following the conversation as best she could, and Martha's venomous tone needed no translation. She stepped forward, standing tall despite her fear, and looked directly at the preacher's widow. Then she did something that stunned everyone present. She spoke. "Not evil," she said, her voice rusty from disuse but clear enough to understand. "Help animals. Help people." The effect of her words was electric. Several of the townspeople crossed themselves, and more than one gun was halfway drawn before cooler heads prevailed. "The demon speaks!" Martha shrieked. "Do you see? She's been hiding her abilities, pretending to be mute. What other deceptions has she practiced?" Dr. Crane had produced his notebook again and was scribbling furiously. "Fascinating. Selective mutism combined with apparent telepathic abilities with animals. The research possibilities are extraordinary." "She's not a research subject," Ethan said, his hand moving to his gun. "She's a human being with the same rights as anyone else." Judge Hartwell shook his head sadly. "I'm afraid the law disagrees with you, Mr. Hale. The territorial statutes are quite clear regarding individuals who are deemed mentally incompetent or potentially dangerous to the community. For their own protection and the safety of others, such persons may be committed to appropriate institutions." "What institution?" Ethan demanded. "Where exactly are you planning to take her?" Roosevelt's smile widened. "The Blackwood Institute for the Study of Exceptional Individuals. a private facility in Colorado where she'll receive the finest care and attention. Ethan had heard of Blackwood Institute, and the stories weren't reassuring. It was rumored to be more laboratory than hospital, a place where people went and were never seen again. The thought of Clara Rose trapped in such a place filled him with cold rage. "She's not going anywhere," he said quietly, and something in his tone made several of the riders shift nervously in their saddles. "Mr. Hale," Judge Hartwell said with forced patience, "you're speaking of resisting a lawful court order. That's a serious crime punishable by imprisonment." "So is kidnapping," Ethan replied. "And that's what this is, no matter how you dress it up in legal language." Sheriff Morrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Ethan, I don't like this any more than you do, but I've got my orders. Don't make this harder than it has to be." "Your orders?" Ethan's voice was dangerously quiet. "Who's giving you orders?" "Morrison? Because last I checked, you answered to the people of this county, not to some snake oil salesman from back east." Roosevelt's face flushed with anger. "Mr. Hale, your insults don't change the facts. This individual represents a clear and present danger to the community. Her unnatural abilities could easily be turned to harmful purposes. The only thing I've seen her do is heal frightened animals and try to protect herself from a mob," Ethan shot back. It was then that Clara Rose surprised them all again. She walked forward until she was standing directly in front of Judge Hartwell's horse, her chin raised defiantly despite the tears streaming down her face. "Please," she said, her voice stronger now. "Not hurt anyone. Only help." She placed her hands on the judge's horse, a nervous bay gelding that had been dancing and prancing throughout the confrontation. Immediately, the animal calmed, lowering his head and relaxing his posture. Clara Rose closed her eyes and began that soft humming that had become so familiar to Ethan over the past weeks. "What is she doing, Doctor?" Crane asked breathlessly, his pen moving frantically across his notebook. "She's showing you what her gift really is," Ethan said, though he wasn't entirely sure himself what was happening. Clara Rose's humming grew stronger, and suddenly every horse in the group began to respond. They stopped their restless movements, their ears pricking forward as if listening to something only they could hear. Even the most nervous animals grew calm and still. But there was more to it than simple animal training. As Clara Rose continued her strange song, Ethan could swear he felt something himself, a sense of peace and harmony that seemed to emanate from her like warmth from a fire. It was as if she were somehow connecting all the living beings present, creating a moment of perfect understanding. The effect on the assembled crowd was profound. Several of the townspeople lowered their weapons, their faces soft with wonder. Even Martha Edison seemed shaken, her righteous fury replaced by confusion and something that might have been awe. Judge Hartwell was staring down at Clara Rose with an expression of amazement. What is this feeling?" he asked, his authoritative voice reduced to a whisper. "Peace," Clara Rose said simply, opening her eyes to look up at him. "Understanding, love." For a moment it seemed as if the entire confrontation might dissolve in this unexpected moment of harmony, but then Roosevelt's voice cut through the spell like a knife. "Enough!" he shouted, drawing his pistol. "This proves exactly what I've been saying. She's using some kind of mind control on all of you. Can't you see she's manipulating your thoughts?" The harsh words shattered the peaceful moment like glass. The horses immediately returned to their previous restless state, and the men began reaching for their weapons again. Clara Rose stumbled backward, the effort of maintaining her gift, having clearly exhausted her. "You're wrong," Judge Hartwell said, but his voice lacked its previous conviction. "What I felt? That wasn't manipulation. That was something pure." "You're being deceived by witchcraft." Martha Edison had recovered her composure and her fury. "The devil's greatest trick is making evil appear as good. She's corrupted your mind just as she corrupted that poor horse." Roosevelt seized on her words. "Exactly. This is why she must be contained and studied. Her abilities are too dangerous to remain uncontrolled." Ethan saw the moment when Judge Hartwell's wonder turned back to fear and suspicion. The older man's face hardened as he convinced himself that what he'd experienced was somehow false or dangerous. "Mr. Hale," the judge said formally, "I'm ordering you to step aside. The The girl will come with us by force if necessary. No. Ethan's voice was flat and final. I won't let you take her. Then you'll be arrested as well, Hartwell replied. Sheriff Morrison placed Mr. Hale under arrest for obstruction of justice and resisting a lawful court order. Morrison looked sick, but he began to dismount from his horse. I'm sorry, Ethan. I truly am. That's when the sound of approaching hoofbeats reached them from a different direction. Everyone turned to see a lone rider approaching at a full gallop, dust streaming behind him like a banner. As he drew closer, Ethan recognized Jim Patterson, but the older man's face was grim with urgency. Hold up there, Patterson shouted as he rode into the yard. Before anyone does anything, they'll regret. You'd better hear what I have to say. Roosevelt's face darkened with suspicion. Mr. Patterson, you're interfering with official business. Official business, Patterson laughed harshly as he dismounted. Is that what you call it? When a bunch of strangers ride into our territory and start kidnapping our people? He reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a thick sheaf of papers. I took the liberty of sending some telegrams to Colorado asking about this Blackwood Institute of yours, Roosevelt. Want to guess what I found out? Roosevelt's confident expression wavered slightly. I don't know what you think you've discovered, but I discovered that the Blackwood Institute was shut down by federal marshals 6 months ago. Patterson continued, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. Seems they were conducting illegal medical experiments on their patients. Several people died under mysterious circumstances. A murmur of shock ran through the assembled crowd. Even Judge Hartwell looked shaken by this revelation. That's impossible, Dr. Crane sputtered. Mr. Roosevelt assured me that Blackwood was a reputable facility. Patterson turned his attention to the doctor. And what about you, Dr. Crane? According to the Territorial Medical Board, your license was revoked 2 years ago for conducting unauthorized experiments on charity patients in Denver. You're not even legally allowed to practice medicine. Dr. Crane's face went white, and he began backing his horse away from the group. Roosevelt's calm mask was finally slipping, revealing the desperate predator beneath. These are obvious fabrications, Roosevelt said, but his voice lacked conviction. Lies spread by those who would deny the advancement of medical science. Are they? Patterson held up one of his papers. This is a telegram from the U.S. Marshal's office in Denver. They've been looking for you, Roosevelt, or should I say, Robert Thompson. Seems you've been running the same con in 3 different territories, kidnapping people with unusual abilities and selling them to wealthy collectors who like to keep human curiosities. The revelation hit the crowd like a physical blow. Several of the townspeople who had been supporting Roosevelt began edging away from him, suddenly seeing the situation in a very different light. Judge Hartwell's face had gone red with anger and embarrassment. Is this true, Roosevelt? Have I been deceived into participating in a criminal enterprise? Your Honor, Roosevelt began desperately. I can explain. He never got the chance. With the smooth motion of a man who'd spent years in dangerous situations, Ethan drew his Colt and had it pointed at Roosevelt's chest before anyone could react. Nobody move, Ethan said calmly. I think we've heard enough. Roosevelt's hand had been creeping toward his own weapon, but he froze when he found himself staring down the barrel of Ethan's gun. Around the yard, the dynamic had shifted completely. What had moments before been a confrontation between law and order on one side and rebellion on the other had become something far more complex. Mr. Patterson, Judge Hartwell said heavily, do you have enough evidence to support these allegations? Patterson nodded grimly. More than enough, Your Honor. I've got testimonies from witnesses in 3 territories, medical records from illegal experiments, and financial documents showing Roosevelt's been selling his victims to private collectors for thousands of dollars each. Then, by the authority vested in me by the territorial government, Hartwell announced, I hereby order the arrest of Thomas Roosevelt, also known as Robert Thompson, on charges of kidnapping, fraud, and conspiracy to commit human trafficking. Roosevelt's face twisted with rage and desperation. You fools, do you have any idea what that creature is capable of? She's not human. She's something else entirely. Even if that were true, Judge Hartwell replied coldly, it wouldn't justify what you were planning to do to her. Sheriff Morrison, looking relieved to finally be on the right side of the law, began moving to arrest Roosevelt. But the con man wasn't finished yet. "You'll regret this." Roosevelt snarled, his composure completely shattered. "That thing will bring nothing but death and destruction. Mark my words. She's a harbinger of something dark and terrible." As Morrison placed handcuffs on Roosevelt, Dr. Crane made a desperate bid for freedom, spurring his horse toward the open desert. But he'd barely gone 50 yards when something extraordinary happened. Clara Rose, who had been watching the proceedings with wide eyes, suddenly stepped forward and raised her hand. Every horse in the yard, including the one carrying Dr. Crane, came to an immediate stop. The fleeing doctor found himself sitting on a statue instead of a running horse, completely helpless. "Bring him back," Judge Hartwell ordered, and to everyone's amazement, Clara Rose made a gentle gesture with her hand. Dr. Crane's horse turned around and walked calmly back to the group, its rider too stunned to resist. "How is that possible?" one of the townspeople whispered. "I don't know," Judge Hartwell admitted, looking at Clara Rose with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. "But I know it's not evil. What I felt when she did whatever she did, that was something pure and good." Martha Edison, who had been silent during Roosevelt's exposure, suddenly stepped forward. Her face was still hard with suspicion, but there was something else there now, a flicker of doubt. "Judge," she said slowly, "I still believe there's something unnatural about this girl, but if what Mr. Patterson says is true, then we almost handed her over to men who would have done her terrible harm." She looked directly at Clara Rose, for the first time really seeing her instead of just the threat she represented. "Child," she said carefully, "I may not understand what you are or where your abilities come from, but I can see that you're not evil. I apologize for the fear I've spread about you." Clara Rose's response was immediate and heartbreaking. Tears began flowing down her cheeks as she nodded. Forgiveness. Her hands pressed to her heart in that gesture of gratitude that had become so familiar to Ethan. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but carrying clearly in the silence that had fallen over the yard. As Roosevelt and Dr. Crane were led away in custody, the remaining townspeople began to disperse, their conversations subdued but no longer hostile. The crisis had passed, but Ethan knew that fundamental questions remained unanswered. Judge Hartwell lingered as the others departed, his weathered face thoughtful. "Mr. Hale," he said finally, "I owe you an apology. I allowed myself to be deceived into participating in what would have been a grave injustice." "You weren't the only one," Ethan replied. "Roosevelt was very convincing." "Perhaps," Hartwell mused, "but that doesn't excuse my failure to investigate his claims more thoroughly." He looked at Clara Rose, who was standing quietly beside Ethan. "Miss Clara Rose, I want you to know that you have the full protection of the territorial government. No one will be allowed to take you against your will again." Clara Rose nodded her thanks, but Ethan could see the exhaustion in her face. The morning's events had taken a tremendous toll on her, both physically and emotionally. "However," Hartwell continued, "I must ask, what are your plans, your abilities, whatever their source make you be unique? There will be others like Roosevelt people who would exploit you for their own gain." It was a question Ethan had been wrestling with himself. Clara Rose's gift was remarkable, but it also made her a target. How could they protect her from those who would use her abilities for profit or power? "She stays here," Ethan said firmly. "This is her home now. And if more men like Roosevelt come looking for her, then they'll have to go through me first." Judge Hartwell studied Ethan for a long moment, taking in the determination in his voice and the protective way he stood beside Clara Rose. "You realize what you're taking on, the responsibility for her safety and well-being." "I understand," Ethan replied. Clara Rose surprised them both by stepping forward and taking Ethan's hand in hers. She looked up at Judge Hartwell and spoke with clear determination. "He protects me," she said carefully. "I protect him. We together." The simple words carried a weight of meaning that went far beyond their surface content. This wasn't just about a protector and his charge. It was about two people who had found something in each other worth fighting for. Judge Hartwell nodded slowly. "Very well, but I strongly suggest you both be careful. The world can be cruel to those who are different. As the judge rode away, Ethan and Clara Rose were finally alone in the aftermath of the morning's drama. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken thoughts and emotions. "Are you all right?" Ethan asked gently. Clara Rose nodded, but he could see the tremor in her hands and the exhaustion in her eyes. Using her gift so extensively had clearly drained her. "That was incredible what you did with the horses," he continued. "I've never seen anything like it." She looked up at him with an expression that was both grateful and worried. "Dangerous?" she asked, her voice uncertain. "Not dangerous," Ethan assured her. "Amazing, but I understand why it scares people. They don't know what to make of something they can't explain." Clara Rose was quiet for a moment, then made a series of gestures that he'd learned meant she was trying to communicate something complex. Finally, she spoke again, choosing her words carefully. "Family had gift," she said slowly. "All gone because afraid." The revelation hit Ethan like a physical blow. Your family was killed because of their abilities. Tears began flowing down her cheeks as she nodded. Through a combination of words and gestures, she began to tell him a story that broke his heart. Her family had been horse traders traveling from town to town across the frontier. All of them had possessed some degree of her gift with animals, though hers was the strongest. They'd tried to keep their abilities secret, but eventually their reputation had spread. A group of men not unlike Roosevelt's gang had come for them one night. They'd claimed the family were witches and devil worshippers, spreading corruption wherever they went. Clara Rose had been out tending to the horses when the attack came. She'd hidden in the darkness, listening to her family's screams as their wagons burned. "I ran," she finished, her voice breaking, "alone for long time. Desert almost killed me." Ethan felt a rage building in his chest, unlike anything he'd experienced since the war. The thought of Clara Rose as a child watching her family murdered because of ignorance and fear made him want to hunt down every man responsible and make them pay. But more than that, he felt a profound sadness for all she'd lost. No wonder she'd been so terrified when Roosevelt tried to take her away. She'd already lived through the nightmare of having her life destroyed by those who couldn't understand what she was. "I'm sorry," he said softly, knowing the words were inadequate but needing to say them anyway. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that." Clara Rose wiped her tears and looked up at him with an expression of fierce determination. "Safe here?" she asked. "Safe here," Ethan promised. "I swear to you, Clara Rose, no one will ever take you away from here against your will. Not while I'm alive to prevent it." She smiled through her tears and leaned against him, trusting him with a vulnerability that made his chest tighten with emotions he hadn't felt in years. As he put his arms around her, offering what comfort he could, Ethan realized that something fundamental had changed between them during the crisis. This was no longer just about protecting someone who needed help. Somewhere along the way, Clara Rose had become essential to him in a way he was only beginning to understand. The thought of losing her to Roosevelt's schemes had terrified him, not just because it would have been unjust, but because it would have meant losing something precious and irreplaceable. As they stood together in the afternoon sunlight, surrounded by the horses that had played such a crucial role in her rescue, Ethan found himself making a silent promise. Whatever the future held, whatever challenges they would face, he would stand by Clara Rose's side. She had shown him that miracles were possible, that there was still beauty and wonder in a world he'd thought was empty of both. And perhaps, just perhaps, she might help him find a way to heal the wounds that war and loss had left on his own soul. The road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in years, Ethan Hale felt something that might have been hope stirring in his heart. The crisis had passed, but their real journey together was just beginning. The days following Roosevelt's arrest brought an unexpected peace to the Double H Ranch. But Ethan could sense that Clara Rose was struggling with something deeper than the trauma of the recent confrontation. She'd grown quieter, more withdrawn, spending long hours in the corral with the horses, but speaking less and less as the weeks passed. Her gifts seemed to be growing stronger. He'd watched her calm a rattlesnake that had wandered into the yard, and just yesterday she'd somehow convinced a hawk with a broken wing to let her treat its injury, but each use of her abilities left her more exhausted than before. It was during one of these quiet evenings as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson that Clara Rose finally spoke about what was troubling her. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice still carrying that careful deliberation she used when choosing her words. "Something coming." He turned to look at her, noting the tension in her shoulders and the distant look in her green eyes. "What do you mean?" She struggled for a moment, making those familiar gestures as she searched for the right words. "Animals, afraid, earth, feels wrong." Before Ethan could ask what she meant, Thunder's urgent whinny cut through the evening air. The stallion was standing at the far edge of the corral, his head raised and ears pricked forward as he stared toward the eastern horizon. One by one, the other horses joined him, all facing the same direction with an alertness that made Ethan's skin crawl. "What do they see?" he asked, squinting into the distance. Clara Rose stood up slowly, her face pale with concentration. She walked to the edge of the porch and placed her hands flat against one of the wooden posts, closing her eyes, as if listening to something only she could hear. When she opened her eyes again, they were wide with fear. "Storm," she whispered. "Big storm, but not rain." As if summoned by her words, a gust of wind swept across the ranch, carrying with it the acrid smell of smoke and something else, something that made the horses begin moving restlessly in their corral. In the distance, Ethan could see a dark line forming along the horizon, but it wasn't the familiar gray-black of rain clouds. This was different, more ominous, tinged with an orange glow that spoke of fire. "Sandstorm." Ethan breathed understanding flooding through him. He'd heard stories of the great desert storms that could bury entire settlements, but he'd never experienced one himself. "How long do we have?" Clara Rose tilted her head, still listening to whatever signals the earth was sending her. "Not long, maybe 1 hour. An hour to prepare for a storm that could last for days." Ethan's mind raced through everything that needed to be done, securing the animals, boarding up the windows, gathering supplies of food and water. But even as he began making mental lists, he realized that preparation might not be enough. The Double H Ranch sat in an exposed valley with little natural protection from the kind of storm he could see building on the horizon. "We need shelter," he said more to himself than to Clara Rose. "Somewhere the storm can't reach us." Clara Rose surprised him by taking his hand and leading him down from the porch toward the horses. Thunder was still standing at the edge of the corral, but now he was looking directly at Clara Rose with what could only be described as intelligence. "He knows something," she said, releasing Ethan's hand to approach the stallion. "He's trying to tell us something." She placed her hands on Thunder's neck and closed her eyes, entering that strange communion that never failed to amaze Ethan. After a moment, her eyes snapped open with excitement. "Canyon?" she said urgently. "Hidden canyon. Thunder knows. Safe place." Ethan looked toward the approaching storm, now close enough that he could see individual dust devils dancing along its leading edge. The air pressure was dropping rapidly, making his ears pop and sending an unnatural chill through the desert heat. "How far, Ta?" he asked. Clara Rose communicated silently with Thunder for another moment, then held up her hands to indicate distance. "Maybe 2 miles, but hidden. Hard to find." 2 miles through increasingly dangerous terrain with a massive sandstorm bearing down on them. It was a desperate gamble, but staying at the ranch would be suicide. Already the wind was picking up, sending tumbleweeds cartwheeling across the yard and forcing them to squint against the stinging sand. "Get the essential supplies," Ethan ordered, his military training taking over. "Water, food for 3 days, blankets, medical kit. Nothing else." Clara Rose nodded and ran toward the house while Ethan began saddling Thunder and 2 other horses with frantic efficiency. The animals were nervous but seemed to understand the urgency of the situation. When Clara Rose returned with their supplies packed into saddlebags, he helped her mount Duchess while he swung up onto Thunder. "Lead the way," he told the stallion, trusting Clara Rose's connection with the animal more than his own sense of direction. Thunder didn't hesitate. The horse set off at a steady trot toward what looked like empty desert, but Ethan noticed that the other animals followed without question. Whatever Thunder knew, they trusted it completely. The storm was moving faster than Ethan had anticipated. What had started as a distant line on the horizon was now a towering wall of dust and debris that blotted out half the sky. The wind was howling with increasing intensity, and the air was thick with sand that made breathing difficult and visibility poor. Thunder led them up a series of rocky ridges that Ethan had never noticed before, following what might have been an ancient animal trail. The terrain grew increasingly rough, and several times Ethan wondered if they were riding to their deaths rather than safety. But Clara Rose seemed calm. Her eyes closed as she maintained her connection with Thunder, trusting the horse to guide them to salvation. They'd been riding for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes when Thunder suddenly stopped at what appeared to be a solid rock wall. Ethan was about to protest that they'd reached a dead end when Clara Rose dismounted and walked directly toward the stone barrier. "Here," she called, though her voice was barely audible over the howling wind. "Opening here." Ethan squinted through the swirling sand and saw that she was right. What had looked like solid rock was actually a cleverly concealed opening in the cliff face, barely wide enough for a horse to pass through, but offering access to whatever lay beyond. Thunder entered the narrow passage without hesitation, and the other horses followed. The relief from the wind was immediate and overwhelming. One moment they were being battered by the full force of the storm, and the next they were in relative calm, though they could still hear the tempest raging outside. The passage opened into a hidden canyon that took Ethan's breath away. It was roughly circular, perhaps 200 yards across, with sheer walls that rose at least 100 feet on all sides. A small spring bubbled up from the center of the canyon floor, creating a pool of clear water surrounded by surprisingly lush vegetation. Ancient petroglyphs covered the walls, and the remains of old fire pits suggested that this place had been used as shelter for countless generations. "How did Thunder know about this place?" Ethan asked in amazement. Clara Rose was already exploring the canyon, her face bright with wonder despite their desperate circumstances. "Old memories," she said, running her fingers along one of the petroglyphs. "Animals remember, stories passed down, mother to child, for many years." As if to confirm her words, Thunder walked directly to a section of the canyon wall where a natural overhang created a perfect shelter for both horses and humans. The ground beneath the overhang was dry and level, clearly worn smooth by centuries of use. They worked quickly to establish their camp, unsaddling the horses and arranging their meager supplies. Outside the canyon, the storm had arrived in full force. They could hear the wind screaming overhead and see dust and debris swirling past the narrow entrance. But inside their hidden sanctuary, the air was calm and clean. As darkness fell and the storm continued to rage, Ethan built a small fire using deadwood from the sparse trees that grew near the spring. Clara Rose sat beside him, staring into the flames with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You saved us," he said softly. "If you hadn't listened to Thunder—" She shook her head. "Thunder saved us. I just listened." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts. The firelight played across the ancient petroglyphs, bringing the primitive drawings to life with dancing shadows. Ethan found himself wondering about the people who had first discovered this place, how many storms they had weathered within these protective walls. "Ethan," Clara Rose said suddenly, her voice quiet but urgent, "need to tell you something." He turned to face her, fully noting the serious expression on her face. "What is it?" She took a deep breath, clearly steeling herself for something difficult. "Gift is growing stronger, harder to control." As if to illustrate her point, one of the horses nickered softly from across the canyon, though Clara Rose hadn't made any apparent attempt to communicate with it. "Today with Hawk," she continued, "felt its pain like my own pain. And horses sometimes hear my thoughts when I don't mean to share them." Ethan considered this revelation carefully. He'd noticed that her abilities seemed to be expanding, but he hadn't realized the toll it was taking on her. "Is it hurting you?" he asked. Clara Rose nodded reluctantly. Like dam breaking. Water getting stronger, harder to hold back." She held up her hands, which Ethan now noticed were trembling slightly. "Sometimes feel everything, every animal for miles. Their fear, their pain, their joy, all at once. The implications of what she was telling him sent a chill through Ethan that had nothing to do with the desert night. If her abilities continued to grow unchecked, she could be overwhelmed by the constant input from every living thing around her. "When did this start?" he asked. "After that day, when bad men came." She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking very young and vulnerable. "When I used gift to control all the horses at once, something changed." Ethan moved closer to her, offering what comfort he could. "We'll figure it out," he promised. "There has to be someone who can help you learn to control it." Clara Rose looked up at him with eyes that held both hope and despair. What if I hurt someone? What if gift becomes too strong and I can't stop it?" Before Ethan could answer, a new sound reached them from outside the canyon, not the howling of wind or the whistle of sand through stone, but something else, something that made both of them freeze with sudden terror. Voices. Human voices barely audible over the storm, but definitely there. "Did you hear that?" Ethan whispered. Clara Rose nodded, her face pale with fear. She closed her eyes and extended her senses, trying to determine how many people were out there and what their intentions might be. "4 men," she whispered after a moment. "Maybe 5. They're looking for something, for someone." Ethan's blood ran cold. Who would be traveling through a sandstorm this severe? Only someone with a very compelling reason to be out in such dangerous conditions. Someone hunting for something valuable enough to risk their lives. The voices grew closer, and Ethan could make out fragments of conversation carried on the chaotic wind. Tracks led this way. "Can't have gone far in this storm. Boss wants them alive if possible." Ethan drew his Colt and motioned for Clara Rose to move deeper into the shadows beneath the overhang. The horses had grown restless, sensing the approaching danger, but Clara Rose managed to calm them with a gentle touch and a whispered word. The voices were very close now, just outside the hidden entrance to the canyon. Ethan held his breath, praying that the storm would mask any signs of their presence. "There's something here," a rough voice called out. "Looks like a crack in the rocks." "Big enough for horses," another voice responded. "Maybe. Hard to tell in this wind." Ethan's heart was pounding so hard he was afraid the sound might give them away. They were trapped. There was no other way out of the canyon, and if these men found the entrance, there would be nowhere to run. That's when Clara Rose did something that took his breath away. She stood up and walked calmly toward the horses, placing her hands on Thunder's neck. The stallion immediately grew still, and his calm spread to the other animals like ripples on a pond. But it was more than just calming the horses. As Ethan watched in amazement, Clara Rose seemed to extend her influence beyond their hidden sanctuary. The storm itself began to shift and swirl around the canyon entrance, creating a wall of wind and sand that would make it nearly impossible for anyone to approach. The voices outside grew confused and frustrated. "Can't see anything in this mess." "Wind's too strong here. We need to find shelter. This whole area's cursed." "Let's get out of here." Gradually the voices faded as the searchers moved away, driven back by the localized storm that Clara Rose had somehow created. Only when the last sound of their presence had disappeared did she release her concentration, staggering backward with exhaustion. Ethan caught her as she fell, pulling her close to steady her. She was shaking with fatigue and emotional strain, and he could feel the heat radiating from her skin as if she'd been running for miles. "How did you do that?" he asked in wonder. "Don't know." She whispered, her voice barely audible. "Felt the storm. Asked it to help us. It listened." She looked up at him with frightened eyes. "Getting stronger, Ethan. Much stronger, and I don't know how to stop it." He held her tighter, offering what protection he could against forces that neither of them fully understood. Outside the canyon, the natural sandstorm continued to rage, but Clara Rose had fallen into an exhausted sleep in his arms. As Ethan kept watch through the long night, listening to the wind howl overhead and feeling the weight of Clara Rose's trust in his protection, he found himself wondering what they would face when the storm finally passed. Who had been hunting them with such determination that they'd risk traveling through a sandstorm, and more importantly, How much longer could Clara Rose control abilities that seemed to be growing beyond her ability to handle? The ancient petroglyphs seemed to watch over them in the firelight, silent witnesses to countless other storms and dangers that had passed through this hidden sanctuary. But Ethan had a feeling that the challenges they faced were unlike anything the canyon's previous occupants had ever encountered. Dawn brought with it a gradual lessening of the wind and a slow clearing of the air. The storm was finally beginning to pass, leaving behind a landscape transformed by the hours of sand and fury. When Clara Rose woke, she seemed more rested, but no less troubled by the growing power she couldn't fully control. "We should go back to the ranch," Ethan said as they prepared to leave their sanctuary. "See what damage the storm did." But Clara Rose shook her head, looking toward the canyon entrance with an expression of deep concern. "Not safe yet," she said. "They're still out there, still looking." As if summoned by her words, Thunder raised his head and whickered softly, his ears pricked towards something only he could detect. Clara Rose immediately placed her hands on the stallion's neck, her face growing pale as she accessed whatever information he was sharing. "6 men now," she said urgently, waiting, watching the ranch. Ethan felt a surge of anger mixed with fear. Whoever these people were, they were persistent and well organized. But more than that, they seemed to know far too much about Clara Rose and her abilities. "Who are they?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Clara Rose's next words confirmed his worst fears. "They work for men like Roosevelt, but these ones, different, more dangerous." She turned to face him, her green eyes blazing with a mixture of determination and fear. "They won't give up Ethan, ever. As long as I'm free, there will always be more of them." The weight of what she was saying hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't just about Roosevelt's failed scheme, it was about something much larger and more systematic. There were others out there who knew about people like Clara Rose, others who would stop at nothing to capture and exploit them. "Then we'll have to make sure they never succeed," Ethan said firmly. "Whatever it takes." Clara Rose smiled through her tears, but it was a sad smile filled with the knowledge that their troubles were far from over. "Together?" she asked, echoing the words she'd spoken to Judge Hartwell. "Together?" Ethan confirmed, taking her hand in his. As they prepared to leave their hidden sanctuary and face whatever dangers waited in the transformed landscape beyond both of them, knew that their quiet life at the Double H Ranch was over. The storm had passed, but it had left them changed, tested by forces both natural and human that had pushed them to their limits. What lay ahead would test them even further, but they would face it as they had faced the storm together with courage, born of necessity, and a love that was growing stronger with each trial they endured. The petroglyphs watched them go, ancient symbols of survival and endurance that had witnessed countless storms and countless departures. The hidden canyon would keep their secrets safe, waiting for the next travelers who might need its protection from the harsh realities of a world that too often feared what it could not understand. The journey back to the ranch took them through a landscape utterly transformed by the storm. What had once been familiar trails were now buried under shifting dunes of sand and landmarks. Ethan had known for years had been scoured away or completely reshaped. But Thunder seemed to navigate by some internal compass that transcended the physical changes, leading them steadily toward home, while Clara Rose maintained her vigilant connection to the world around them. They were still 2 miles from the ranch when Clara Rose suddenly pulled Duchess to a halt, her face going white with alarm. "Stop," she whispered urgently. "They're moving." Ethan reined in Thunder, every sense alert for danger. "How many—" Clara Rose closed her eyes, extending her awareness like invisible tendrils across the desert. 8 now. No. 9. They've been waiting all night. Some at the ranch, others watching the trails. Her eyes snapped open, bright with fear, and something else, a growing anger that seemed to pulse with its own energy. "They have weapons. Many weapons." The implication was clear. These weren't men interested in negotiation or legal niceties. They'd come prepared for war, and Clara Rose was their prize. "We can't go back to the ranch," Ethan said, his mind racing through their limited options. "They'll be watching every approach." "No," Clara Rose said firmly, her voice carrying a new strength that surprised him. "Enough running. Enough hiding. She dismounted from Duchess and walked to a small rise that overlooked the valley containing their home. From here they could see the ranch buildings in the distance looking deceptively peaceful in the morning sunlight. But Ethan knew Clara Rose could sense the men hidden there, waiting like spiders in their web. "Clara?" he began, but she held up a hand to silence him. "Listen," she said, her voice carrying an odd resonance that seemed to vibrate in his chest. "Do you hear it?" At first Ethan heard nothing but the usual desert sounds wind through sagebrush, the distant cry of a hawk, the soft snorting of their horses. But gradually he became aware of something else, a subtle rhythm that seemed to pulse through the very ground beneath his feet. "What is it?" he asked. Clara Rose's eyes were closed again, but now there was a look of profound concentration on her face. "Everything," she whispered, "every living thing for miles. They're all connected, all part of the same song." As she spoke, Ethan began to see what she meant. The hawks circling overhead, the jackrabbits hiding in the brush, the rattlesnakes coiled in the shade of rocks. Even the insects buzzing in the air, they all seemed to be moving in some kind of harmony, responding to rhythms he couldn't detect, but Clara Rose clearly could. "They're afraid," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "All of them. The men with guns. They bring fear and death. The desert wants them gone." "Clara," Ethan said carefully, recognizing the dangerous power building in her voice. "What are you thinking?" She opened her eyes and looked at him with an expression he'd never seen before, not the frightened girl who'd stood on the auction block, not even the determined young woman who'd faced down Roosevelt's gang. This was something new, something that carried the weight of ancient wisdom and terrible purpose. "I'm thinking," she said slowly, "that it's time these men learned what it means to threaten something the desert protects." Before Ethan could protest or ask what she intended, Clara Rose placed both hands flat against the ground and closed her eyes once more. But this time was different. This time Ethan could actually feel the power flowing out of her, a presence so strong it made the air itself seem to thicken and pulse. The effect was immediate and stunning. Every horse within miles began moving toward the ranch, not in panic, but with deliberate purpose. Wild Mustangs that normally avoided human contact came thundering down from the high mesas. Ranch horses broke out of corrals and pastures. Even horses from neighboring spreads joined the gathering herd, all converging on the Double H Ranch like iron filings drawn to a magnet. But it wasn't just horses. Cattle began lowing and moving in the same direction. Coyotes emerged from their dens, padding silently through the sagebrush with yellow eyes fixed on the distant buildings. Hawks and eagles circled lower and lower, their cries growing more aggressive. Even the usually solitary desert creatures, mountain lions, bobcats, and bears, began making their way toward the ranch from every direction. "My God," Ethan breathed, watching the unprecedented gathering unfold before his eyes. "Clara, what have you done?" "What I should have done a long time ago," she replied, her voice carrying an otherworldly resonance that seemed to echo from the rocks themselves. "I've asked for help." The men hidden around the ranch clearly sensed that something was wrong. Ethan could see distant figures emerging from their hiding places, looking around in confusion as the first animals began to arrive. What had started as a simple ambush was rapidly becoming something far more complex and dangerous. Thunder whickered softly beside them, and Clara Rose opened her eyes to look at the stallion with obvious affection. "He wants to join them," she said. "They all do, but I've asked them to be patient a little longer." "Clara," Ethan said urgently, "I understand you want to stop these men, but if you're not careful, someone's going to get killed, maybe a lot of someone's." She turned to face him fully, and for a moment he saw a flicker of the frightened girl she'd been. "I don't want to hurt anyone," she said softly. "But they came here to hurt us, to take me away and do terrible things to me. How many more people like me will suffer if I don't stop this?" It was a question that went to the heart of everything they'd been through. Roosevelt had mentioned other victims, other people with unusual abilities who'd been kidnapped and exploited. If Clara Rose didn't make a stand here, how many others would fall prey to similar schemes? "What do you need me to do?" Ethan asked, making his choice. Clara Rose's smile was radiant with gratitude and love. "Be ready," she said simply, "and trust me." She remounted Duchess and began riding slowly toward the ranch, with Ethan following close behind on Thunder. As they approached, the scale of what Clara Rose had accomplished became truly apparent. Hundreds of animals had gathered around the ranch buildings: horses, cattle, wild game predators, and prey, all standing together in an unprecedented display of unity. The men who'd been lying in ambush were now clearly visible, standing in a tight group near the main house with their weapons drawn. But their confidence had evaporated in the face of this supernatural gathering. These were hard men killers, probably, but they'd never encountered anything like this. "What the hell is happening?" one of them shouted as Clara Rose and Ethan rode into the yard. The man who appeared to be their leader was tall and lean, with cold gray eyes and a face marked by years of violence. He kept his rifle trained on Clara Rose, but Ethan could see the uncertainty in his posture. "You boys looking for me?" Clara Rose asked, her voice carrying clearly across the yard despite the soft tone. She dismounted and was walking calmly toward the group of armed men, showing no fear despite being outnumbered and outgunned. "You're coming with us, sir," the leader said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Dead or alive makes no difference to us." Clara Rose stopped about 20 feet from the group, well within range of their weapons, but somehow projecting an aura of invulnerability that made their threats seem hollow. "I don't think so," she said pleasantly. "You see, this is my home now, and the desert doesn't like strangers who come here meaning harm." As if summoned by her words, the animals surrounding them began to move closer, not aggressively, but with a deliberate intent that was far more unnerving than any display of hostility would have been. The horses formed a living wall around the armed men, while the predators, coyotes, mountain lions, and bears positioned themselves at strategic points with the patience of experienced hunters. "This is impossible," one of the men whispered, his rifle shaking in his hands. "Animals don't behave like this." "You're right," Clara Rose agreed. "They don't, unless they have a very good reason." She raised her hand, and every animal in the yard turned to look at her with what could only be described as attention. The silence that followed was profound and terrifying, filled with the weight of hundreds of predatory gazes focused on the small group of increasingly frightened men. "Here's what's going to happen," Clara Rose continued, her voice taking on that otherworldly resonance again. "You're going to put down your weapons and walk away. You're going to tell whoever sent you that this territory is under protection now, and that anyone who threatens the people under that protection will answer to forces they can't understand or control." The leader of the group laughed nervously. "You're bluffing. They're just animals. They can't understand what you're saying." Clara Rose's smile was sad but determined. "You're wrong about that too," she said softly. She made a subtle gesture with her hand, and every horse in the yard took a single step forward. The sound of hundreds of hooves hitting the ground in perfect unison was like thunder, and the effect on the armed men was immediate. Several of them dropped their weapons involuntarily, their nerve finally breaking. "But I don't want to hurt you," Clara Rose continued. "Violence only creates more violence, and I've seen enough of that to last several lifetimes. So I'm going to give you a choice." She pointed toward the trail that led away from the ranch. "You can leave now peacefully and never come back. Tell whoever sent you that Clara Rose is under the protection of forces they can't comprehend, and that any further attempts to capture or harm her will be met with consequences they won't survive." "And if we refuse?" the leader asked, though his bravado was clearly forced. Clara Rose's expression grew sad. "Then I'll let them decide what to do with you," she said, gesturing toward the assembled animals. "And I promise you, their justice will be swifter and more final than anything human law could provide." As if to emphasize her point, a massive grizzly bear emerged from behind the barn, moving with the fluid grace of a creature that feared nothing on earth. It positioned itself directly behind the group of men, close enough that they could hear its breathing and smell its wild musk. That broke the last of their resistance. One by one, the men began dropping their weapons and backing toward their horses, which stood waiting with unusual patience despite the presence of so many predators. "This isn't over," the leader said as he mounted his horse. "There are others, more powerful than us. They won't be frightened away by your circus tricks." Clara Rose nodded sadly. "I know," she said. "But when they come, they'll find us ready." As the defeated gunmen rode away, the assembled animals began to disperse as gradually as they'd gathered. The wild creatures melted back into the desert, while the domestic animals returned to their proper homes with the same purposeful calm they'd shown in coming together. Within an hour, the ranch yard looked normal again, as if the extraordinary gathering had never happened. Only the discarded weapons scattered across the ground bore witness to what had transpired. Ethan found Clara Rose sitting on the porch steps, her face pale with exhaustion, but her eyes bright with satisfaction. He sat down beside her, still trying to process what he'd witnessed. "That was incredible," he said finally. "I've never seen anything like it." Clara Rose leaned against his shoulder, suddenly looking very young and vulnerable again. "It was necessary," she said softly. "But it was also dangerous. Using that much power, I could feel myself almost losing control." "But you didn't lose control," Ethan pointed out. "You did exactly what you intended to do, and no one got hurt." She smiled wryly. "This time. But what about next time? Because there will be a next time, Ethan. That man was right. There are others, and they won't be discouraged by what happened here today." It was a sobering thought. What they'd accomplished was remarkable, but it was also a declaration of war against forces they didn't fully understand. By demonstrating the true extent of Clara Rose's abilities, they'd probably ensured that even more dangerous enemies would come looking for her. "Then we'll face them together," Ethan said firmly. "Whatever comes, we'll be ready." Clara Rose was quiet for a long moment, then surprised him by taking his hand in both of hers. "Ethan," she said softly, "there's something else I need to tell you." He turned to look at her, noting the serious expression on her face. "What is it?" She took a deep breath, clearly steeling herself for something difficult. "When I was connecting with all those animals today, I felt something else. Something I've never felt before." "What kind of something?" Clara Rose placed his hand against her stomach, her eyes bright with tears of joy. "New life," she whispered, "growing inside me. Our child Ethan." The words hit him like a physical blow, sending his mind reeling with implications and emotions too complex to immediately process. A child. Their child. In the midst of all the danger and uncertainty, life had found a way to assert itself. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, her smile radiant despite the tears flowing down her cheeks. "I can feel it. The same way I feel the animals. A tiny spark of consciousness just beginning to grow." Ethan pulled her into his arms, holding her tight as the full weight of this revelation settled over him. They were going to be parents. In a world that was often hostile to anyone different, they were bringing a child into existence, a child who would likely inherit at least some of Clara Rose's extraordinary abilities. "What will we do?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "We'll love our child," Clara Rose said firmly. "We'll protect them, and we'll teach them to use their gifts to help others, not to harm them." As they sat together on the porch, holding each other and contemplating the future that lay ahead, both of them knew that everything had changed once again. The battle they'd won today was just the beginning of a much larger struggle. But now they had something even more precious to fight for than their own freedom. They had the future of their child to consider. The desert around them seemed to pulse with new possibilities and new challenges. Somewhere out there, powerful forces were already planning their next move, searching for ways to capture or destroy the woman who'd proven that there were some things that couldn't be bought, threatened, or controlled. But here in this moment, surrounded by the land that had become their sanctuary and the animals that had chosen to protect them, Ethan and Clara Rose allowed themselves to dream of a different future. A future where their child could grow up free, where unusual gifts were celebrated rather than feared, and where love was stronger than the forces that sought to divide and conquer. The sun was setting over the Double H Ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to promise both beauty and struggle in the days to come. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new enemies, and new tests of their resolve. But tonight, they had each other. They had hope, and they had the growing life that represented everything they were fighting to protect. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Clara Rose began to hum softly. Not the defensive melody she'd used to control the animals, but something new and gentle, a lullaby for the child she carried. The sound drifted across the desert like a blessing, carrying with it all the love and determination that would be needed for the battles ahead. The story that had begun with a frightened girl on an auction block had become something far greater. A tale of love, conquering fear of courage in the face of impossible odds, and of the power that comes when two people choose to stand together against a world that would tear them apart. And now, with new life growing between them, their story was expanding to encompass not just their own future, but the future of all those who would come after them. In the distance, thunder whinnied softly from the corral as if offering his own blessing on the news. The desert listened and approved, and somewhere in the vast wilderness that surrounded their home, the animals that had answered Clara Rose's call settled down for the night, knowing that they had played their part in something important and enduring. The Double H Ranch slept peacefully under the stars, but its defenders remained vigilant, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring to their doorstep. They had won this battle, but the war for their freedom and their child's future was just beginning. 5 years had passed since that fateful night when Clara Rose hummed her first lullaby under the desert stars, and the Double H Ranch had transformed into something neither Ethan nor Clara Rose could have imagined during those early days of struggle and uncertainty. What had once been a simple cattle ranch had evolved into a sanctuary not just for them and their remarkable daughter, but for others like them who had nowhere else to turn. Hope Hale was everything her name suggested and more. At 4 years old, she possessed her mother's green eyes and auburn hair, but her gift was uniquely her own. While Clara Rose could communicate with animals, Hope seemed to bridge the gap between the animal and human worlds in ways that left even her parents amazed. She spoke in complete sentences to horses before she could properly walk, translated the songs of birds for anyone who would listen, and had once prevented a rattlesnake bite by simply asking the serpent to please go home to your babies. But perhaps most remarkably, Hope had inherited something else from her mother, an ability to heal that went beyond the physical. Ethan had watched in wonder as their daughter placed her tiny hands on wounded creatures and somehow drew the pain and fear out of them, replacing it with peace and wholeness. The ranch itself had grown to accommodate their expanding mission. What had started as a few simple buildings now included a proper medical facility where Dr. Margaret Sinclair, a former Army surgeon who'd been drummed out of the service for treating patients regardless of their race or status, tended to both human and animal patients. There was also a school building where Hope and the other children who'd found refuge at the ranch learned not just reading and arithmetic, but how to understand and control their unique gifts. The morning sun was just cresting the eastern mountains when Ethan found himself standing on the porch of their expanded home, coffee in hand, watching his daughter play in the yard with what most people would consider an impossibly dangerous collection of animals. A young mountain lion lounged in the shade, while Hope braided flowers into its mane, chattering away in a mixture of English and sounds that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than human language. "She's getting stronger every day," Clara Rose said softly, joining him on the porch with her own cup of coffee. Even after 5 years of marriage, her presence still made his heart skip a beat. The frightened girl from the auction block had blossomed into a confident woman whose wisdom and compassion had touched dozens of lives. "Stronger and more stubborn," Ethan replied with a fond smile. "Yesterday she convinced 3 wild horses to help her build a fort. This morning I found her having a serious conversation with a hawk about proper nest architecture." Clara Rose laughed, the sound as melodious as ever. "She gets the stubbornness from you. The gift is all her own." Their peaceful moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Both of them tensed automatically. Even after 5 years of relative peace, they remained vigilant. Too much had happened. Too many attempts had been made to capture Clara Rose or steal Hope away for them to ever truly relax their guard. But the rider who appeared around the bend in the road was familiar and welcome. Jim Patterson, now in his 60s, but still spry enough to make the journey from town twice a week, raised his hand in greeting as he approached. "Morning, folks," he called out as he dismounted. "Got some interesting news from the territorial capital." Patterson had become more than just a neighbor over the years. He'd evolved into their unofficial liaison with the outside world, bringing news and supplies while helping to maintain the carefully constructed network of allies who protected their sanctuary. "Good news or bad news?" Ethan asked, though he was already reading the answer in Patterson's expression. "Bit of both, I'm afraid," the older man replied, removing his hat to wipe sweat from his brow. "The good news is that Governor Houston himself is planning to visit next month. Wants to see for himself what you've built here. Clara Rose and Ethan exchanged glances. Governor Houston had been a cautious ally over the years, providing legal protection for their sanctuary while maintaining enough distance to avoid political complications. A personal visit suggested that something significant was happening. "And the bad news?" Clara Rose asked. Patterson's expression grew serious. "There's been talk in Washington. Seems some folks back east have gotten wind of what's happening out here. They're calling it a security concern and pushing for federal intervention." The implications were clear and chilling. If the federal government decided that their sanctuary represented a threat, they had resources that would make Roosevelt's gang look like children playing at war. "How much time do we have?" Ethan asked. "Hard to say," Patterson replied. "Could be months, could be years. But the governor thinks that if he can present your operation as a legitimate educational and medical facility, it might help deflect some of the pressure." Hope had noticed their visitor and came running over the mountain lion, following at her heels like an oversized house cat. She launched herself into Patterson's arms with the fearless enthusiasm that characterized everything she did. "Uncle Jim," she squealed, using the honorary title she'd bestowed on their old friend. "Sunshine had her babies. Do you want to see them?" Sunshine was a wild mare who'd taken up residence near the ranch buildings, apparently deciding that Clara Rose's sanctuary was the safest place to raise her foal. Hope had appointed herself as the official guardian of all baby animals on the ranch, a responsibility she took very seriously. "I'd love to see them, little one," Patterson said, setting Hope down gently. "But first I need to finish talking to your parents." Hope nodded solemnly, understanding that some conversations were for adults only. "I'll go tell Sunshine you're coming," she announced, then surprised them all by turning to the mountain lion. "Felix, you stay here and help guard the house." The big cat actually seemed to nod in understanding before padding over to a shady spot near the porch, where it could keep watch over the approaches to the house. "That child never ceases to amaze me," Patterson murmured, shaking his head in wonder. "She amazes us too," Clara Rose admitted. "Sometimes I worry about what will happen when she gets older and realizes how different she is from other children." "Different isn't always bad," Patterson pointed out. "Look at what you've accomplished here. 15 families now call this place home, all of them people who had nowhere else to go. You've got children learning to control abilities that would have gotten them killed or locked away in most places. And Dr. Sinclair has saved more lives in the past 3 years than most doctors save in a lifetime." It was true. Word of their sanctuary had spread quietly through networks of people who understood what it meant to be different, to possess abilities that the world feared and misunderstood. They'd welcome families whose children could see the future men who could speak with the dead women who could heal with a touch. Each new arrival had strengthened their community while adding new challenges and responsibilities. "The question is," Ethan said slowly, "how do we protect all of this if the federal government decides we're a threat?" Patterson was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing his words carefully. "There might be a way," he said finally. "The governor has a proposal. It's risky, but it could give you the protection you need." "What kind of proposal?" Clara Rose asked. "He wants to make this place official, turn it into a territorial institution, a school and medical facility with government backing and protection. You'd have to accept some oversight, follow certain regulations, but you'd also have legal standing that would be much harder for Washington to challenge." Ethan felt Clara Rose's tension beside him. The idea of government oversight was troubling. They'd seen how easily officials could be corrupted or intimidated, but the alternative might be losing everything they'd built. "What would that mean for the people here?" Clara Rose asked. "For the children?" "They'd be protected under territorial law," Patterson explained. "No one could take them away without due process, and any research or study would have to be conducted with full consent and oversight." It was a gamble, but it might be their only chance to secure a future for Hope and the other children who'd found refuge at the ranch. As if summoned by their thoughts, the sound of children's laughter drifted across the yard as Hope and the other young residents of the sanctuary played together under the watchful eyes of their unusual guardians. "We'll need to discuss it with the others," Ethan said finally. "This affects everyone here." Patterson nodded. "Take your time. But don't take too long. The political winds are shifting, and it's better to get ahead of the storm than to be caught in it." After Patterson left to visit with Dr. Sinclair and check on some of the other residents, Ethan and Clara Rose walked hand in hand through their transformed ranch. The medical facility was bustling with activity as Dr. Sinclair treated a young boy whose touch could accelerate plant growth, a gift that was both blessing and curse when flowers bloomed and died in moments beneath his fingers. In the school building, they found Maria Santos teaching a class of children whose abilities ranged from precognition to telepathy. Maria herself was a refugee from a town that had tried to burn her as a witch when they discovered she could make crops grow in barren soil. Now she used her gift to feed the sanctuary while teaching others to understand and control their own unique talents. Every one of these people represents a story, Clara Rose said softly as they watched the children at their lessons. Every one of them came here because there was nowhere else to go. And every one of them makes us stronger, Ethan replied, but also more visible, more of a target. They found Hope in the stable sitting cross-legged beside Sunshine and her newborn foal. The mare, who would normally be dangerously protective of her offspring, was calmly allowing Hope to pet and examine the baby while she hummed one of her mother's lullabies. "The babies are perfect," Hope announced without looking up. "Sunshine says thank you for keeping them safe." "You're welcome," Clara Rose replied, as if having conversations with horses through their 4-year-old daughter was the most natural thing in the world. Hope finally looked up at her parents, her green eyes serious beyond her years. "Mama, are the bad men coming back?" The question hit both parents like a physical blow. They'd tried so hard to shield Hope from the dangers that constantly threatened their sanctuary, but children especially. Children with her gifts often sensed things that adults tried to hide. "What makes you ask that, sweetheart?" Clara Rose said, kneeling down to Hope's level. "The animals are worried," Hope replied matter-of-factly. "They remember the last time. They want to know if they should start gathering again." Clara Rose and Ethan exchanged glances over their daughter's head. The network of animal guardians that had protected them 5 years ago had never really disbanded. They'd simply returned to their normal lives while maintaining a connection to the sanctuary that could be activated when needed. "We hope not," Ethan said honestly. "But if they do come, we'll be ready for them." Hope nodded solemnly, then surprised them both by standing up and walking over to place her small hands on each of their arms. "Don't be scared," she said, with the absolute confidence that only children possess. "The desert loves us. It won't let anything bad happen." As if summoned by her words, a golden eagle landed on the stable roof and let out a piercing cry that was somehow reassuring rather than threatening. Other birds began gathering, hawks, ravens, even tiny sparrows, all settling on nearby perches as if awaiting orders. "See," Hope said with satisfaction, "they're ready too." That evening, as the sanctuary settled into its nighttime routines, Ethan and Clara Rose held an emergency meeting with the other adult residents. The question before them was simple but momentous. Should they accept the governor's offer of official recognition with all the protection and oversight that would entail? Dr. Sinclair was the first to speak. "I've seen what happens when the government gets involved in matters they don't understand," she said grimly. "But I've also seen what happens when people like us try to stand alone against the world. We need allies, and sometimes that means making compromises." Maria Santos nodded in agreement. "My village tried to handle things quietly, tried to pretend I didn't exist. When that failed, they turned to violence. At least with official recognition, there would be laws to protect us." One by one, the other residents shared their thoughts and concerns. Some worried about losing their freedom, others about the children being studied like laboratory specimens. But all of them understood that the alternative might be much worse. Finally, it was Clara Rose who spoke for all of them. "We came here to build something new," she said, her voice carrying the same resonance that had once called hundreds of animals to their aid. "A place where being different wasn't a death sentence, where children with gifts could learn to use them for good instead of hiding in fear." She looked around the room at the faces of people who'd become family people who'd risked everything to build this sanctuary together. "If accepting government oversight means we can protect that dream, then that's what we'll do. But we do it together, and we do it on our terms." The vote was unanimous. As the meeting broke up and families returned to their homes, Ethan and Clara Rose found themselves alone on the porch, once again watching the stars emerge in the clear desert sky. Hope had long since been put to bed, but her presence seemed to fill the night air with possibility and promise. "Do you think we're making the right choice?" Clara Rose asked, leaning against Ethan's shoulder. "I think we're making the only choice we can," he replied, "and I think our daughter will grow up in a world where being gifted isn't a curse to be hidden, but a blessing to be shared." In the distance, thunder whinnied softly from the pasture where he spent his retirement years surrounded by mares and foals, who looked to him as the wise patriarch of their herd. The sound was picked up and echoed by other horses throughout the valley, creating a symphony of welcome that seemed to embrace the entire sanctuary. "Whatever comes next," Clara Rose said softly, "we'll face it together." Together, Ethan agreed, pulling her close as the desert night settled around their home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new visitors, and new decisions that would shape the future of their sanctuary. But tonight, under the vast canopy of stars that had witnessed their journey from that first desperate auction to this moment of hard-won peace, they allowed themselves to believe that love and determination could overcome any obstacle. The story that had begun with a frightened girl on an auction block had become something far greater, a testament to the power of compassion, the strength that comes from community, and the unbreakable bonds that form when people choose to stand together against a world that would divide them. And in the years to come, as Hope and the other children of the sanctuary grew into their gifts and took their place in a world that was slowly learning to accept what it had once feared, the Double H Ranch would stand as proof that even the most impossible dreams could become reality when they were built on a foundation of love. The desert wind carried their story across the vast wilderness, spreading hope to other hidden communities and lost souls who were still searching for a place to call home. And somewhere in that wind was the echo of Clara Rose's first lullaby, still singing its message of comfort and belonging to anyone brave enough to listen.